The spark of conflict. The grocery store hummed with life on a crisp Tuesday morning. Harrison's Grocers, a beloved local chain, was as lively as ever, bustling with shoppers pushing carts down aisles laden with fresh produce, baked goods, and household essentials. Known for its warm atmosphere, the store was a safe haven for many, a place where neighbors waved, toddlers begged for sugary cereals, and the staff offered cheerful smiles. Karen Lancaster strode into the store with a sense of purpose. At 47, she carried herself like a woman on a mission. She prided herself on her sharp wit and willingness to stand up for what she believed was right. As she adjusted her purse strap and grabbed a cart, she surveyed the store with a keen eye, her mind racing with thoughts of the latest social issues that fueled her personal crusade for justice. Karen had always considered herself a fighter for the underdog. A self-proclaimed activist, she followed every political debate, read countless articles, and kept a mental checklist of causes she believed deserved her voice. To her, complacency was complicity, and silence was unacceptable. Harrison's Grocers wasn't just a place to buy food, it was a stage where she could act on her convictions, should the opportunity arise. As she turned into the snacks aisle, her gaze froze on a single, glaring detail that made her blood boil. There, in front of a display of peanut butter jars, stood a tall man in his mid-50s wearing a bright red MAGA hat. The hat sat proudly atop his head, as bold as a flashing neon sign. Karen stopped dead in her tracks. Her chest tightened, her grip on her cart grew firmer, and a storm of indignation brewed within her. Here. In my town. In 2024. She thought. Her heart raced, her mind replaying countless media stories, protests, and debates. That red hat, to her, was more than a piece of fabric. It represented division, ignorance, and the unraveling of the values she held dear. Her initial instinct was to walk away, to let it go and continue shopping. But the thought was fleeting. Karen had never been one to let things slide. The man's oblivious demeanor as he casually debated between creamy and crunchy peanut butter only added fuel to the fire. Not today, she muttered under her breath. Not in my store. Straightening her shoulders, Karen pushed her cart forward, her heels clicking against the tile floor with determination. She rehearsed what she would say in her mind, ensuring her tone would be firm, her arguments watertight. The man didn't notice her approach. His focus remained on the jars in front of him, his expression relaxed and unbothered. Karen stopped a few feet away and took a deep breath. "Excuse me," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the aisle. The man turned, his brows lifting slightly in surprise. His face was calm, his blue eyes meeting hers with mild curiosity. He tilted his head slightly, as though wondering why a stranger was addressing him so abruptly. Karen gestured toward his hat with a dramatic wave of her hand. "Do you really think it's appropriate to wear that in public?" she asked, her tone laced with disapproval. The man blinked, seemingly caught off guard. He glanced upward, as if reminding himself of what he was wearing. "My hat?" he asked, his voice steady. "Yes, your hat," Karen snapped, her voice rising. "It's offensive, divisive, and downright disgusting." For a moment, the man didn't reply. He simply studied her, his lips curling into a faint, knowing smile. "Ma'am," he said finally, his voice calm but firm, "it's just a hat." Karen's nostrils flared. "It's not just a hat," she countered. "That thing represents everything wrong with this country. You think you can walk around like nothing's wrong? Like people don't see you and feel uncomfortable?" As Karen's voice grew louder, nearby shoppers began to take notice. Some paused their browsing to glance over, their curiosity piqued. A young couple whispered to each other as they lingered near a shelf of crackers. An older man pulled out his phone, angling it discreetly to record the unfolding drama. The man in the MAGA hat shrugged, unbothered by the growing audience. "Last time I checked, this is America," he said calmly. "People can wear what they want. Freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from consequences, Karen retorted, her tone dripping with righteous fury. Then, without warning, Karen lunged forward and snatched the hat off his head. The crowd gasped audibly, the sound echoing through the aisle like a crack of thunder. The man froze, his hand instinctively brushing his now bare head. Karen held the hat aloft like a trophy, her chest heaving with adrenaline. "There," she declared triumphantly. "Maybe now you'll think twice before parading your ignorance around decent people." For a moment, the man simply stood there, silent, his gaze fixed on Karen. Slowly, he took a step forward, and Karen's victorious grin faltered. It was only then that she realized just how tall he was, how broad his shoulders seemed when he stood at his full height. "Give me my hat," he said, his voice calm but edged with a quiet authority that sent a chill down Karen's spine. "No," Karen said, her grip tightening on the hat. "You don't deserve to wear it." The man sighed, shaking his head. Then, to Karen's surprise, he bent down and picked up the hat she had dropped onto the floor during the commotion. He dusted it off carefully, as though handling something of great value. "You don't know who I am, do you?" he asked, his tone conversational but laced with an undercurrent of warning. Karen crossed her arms defiantly. "I don't need to know who you are," she said. "I know enough. You're exactly what's wrong with this country." The man chuckled softly, the sound low and almost amused. "Well," he said, placing the hat back on his head with deliberate care, "you've made your point, ma'am. But you might want to be careful. Actions have a way of coming back to bite you." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Karen standing in the aisle, her face flushed with a mix of anger and uncertainty. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder as shoppers exchanged glances and whispered among themselves. Some looked at Karen with admiration, others with disbelief. The older man with the phone smirked as he continued recording. Karen straightened her posture, determined not to let the man's parting words shake her. She had done what she believed was right, and no amount of criticism from onlookers would convince her otherwise. But as she pushed her cart down the aisle, a nagging sense of unease began to creep in. Who was that man? And why did his calm demeanor feel more unsettling than any argument she had ever faced? Unbeknownst to Karen, this was only the beginning. The events that followed would not only challenge her convictions but also reveal truths she was unprepared to face. The ripple effect. The drama in the peanut butter aisle sent shockwaves through the store. While Karen resumed her shopping, her head held high, the whispers and murmurs of those who had witnessed the altercation grew louder. The scene had unfolded like a movie, and now, the audience was left wondering about the next act. Near the front of the store, a group of employees gathered near the customer service desk. Tyler, the young employee Karen had barked at, stood awkwardly at the center of the group. His face was flushed, and he fidgeted with the hem of his uniform shirt. "Did you see it?" one cashier whispered to another. "Yeah," the other replied, wide-eyed. "She just ripped the guy's hat off like it was nothing." Tyler cleared his throat. She told me to get the manager," he said. Should I have done something?" Mike, the store manager, sighed heavily. A middle-aged man with a receding hairline and a perpetual look of mild exhaustion, he rubbed his temples as he listened to the retelling of the incident. "We don't take sides in political disputes," he muttered. "As long as no one's breaking the rules, we let customers handle their own issues." "But, Mike," Tyler said hesitantly, "she was yelling, and people were recording. What if this goes viral?" Mike groaned. The last thing he needed was a PR disaster. Harrison's Grocers had built its reputation on being a welcoming place, free of controversy. "All right, I'll talk to her," he said reluctantly. As Mike made his way toward the heart of the store, Karen was busy in the produce section, examining a pile of oranges with exaggerated focus. She was still replaying the encounter in her mind, mentally patting herself on the back for taking a stand. "Excuse me, ma'am," a voice interrupted her thoughts. Karen turned to see Mike standing a few feet away, his expression calm but serious. Behind him, Tyler lingered nervously, clearly hoping to stay out of whatever was about to happen. Yes. Karen said, her tone cool but defensive. I heard there was an incident earlier, Mike began diplomatically. One of our customers mentioned there might have been some, conflict in the peanut butter aisle. Karen crossed her arms. Conflict, she repeated. Is that what he's calling it? Mike raised his hands in a placating gesture. I'm not here to take sides. I just want to make sure everyone in the store feels comfortable. Karen's jaw tightened. Comfortable? That man was wearing a symbol of hate and division. How is that comfortable for anyone? Mike sighed. I understand your concerns, but we can't police what people wear. As long as it's not obscene or threatening, we don't intervene. Karen's voice rose, drawing the attention of nearby shoppers. So you're just going to let people walk around spreading hate? Is that the kind of business you run? Mike glanced around, aware of the growing audience. Ma'am, I'm asking you to please lower your voice, he said firmly. Karen's face flushed with indignation. Lower my voice? Why don't you tell him to leave instead of lecturing me? Tyler, who had been inching further away, decided it was safer to retreat entirely. Mike, however, held his ground. Ma'am, if this escalates further, I'll have to ask you to leave the store, he said, his tone more resolute now. Karen gasped, appalled. Me? You're going to throw me out for standing up to a bully? Mike pinched the bridge of his nose. I'm asking everyone to follow the rules and be respectful. That's all. Karen scoffed. Fine, she snapped. I'll finish my shopping and be on my way. But you haven't heard the last of this. As Mike walked away, shaking his head, Karen muttered under her breath. Typical. Protect the oppressor and punish the truth-teller. Meanwhile, across the store, the man in the MAGA hat was finishing his shopping at the checkout counter. His demeanor remained calm, almost indifferent, as if the earlier confrontation had barely registered. He chatted amicably with the cashier, a young woman who seemed slightly flustered by his ease. Thanks for shopping with us today, sir, she said as she handed him his receipt. The man nodded. Thank you. And don't worry, I'm sure this little incident will blow over. The cashier smiled weakly, unsure how to respond. As the man walked toward the exit, a few shoppers gave him curious glances, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. Some whispered to each other, speculating about his identity. Do you think he's someone important? One woman murmured to her husband. I don't know, he replied. But he sure doesn't seem fazed by all this. Outside, the man loaded his groceries into the back of a sleek black SUV. As he placed the last bag in the trunk, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, he glanced at the screen and smiled faintly. Yeah, he said, answering the call. It's me. I'll be there in 20 minutes. And no, there's nothing to worry about. Just a minor inconvenience. The man's tone was casual, but his words carried an undercurrent of authority. Whoever he was talking to clearly trusted him implicitly. Back inside the store, Karen was finishing up in the checkout line, still seething. She noticed several people staring at her, some with approval, others with skepticism. A woman behind her in line leaned in slightly. Good for you, the woman whispered. Someone had to say something. Karen smiled tightly, grateful for the support, but her mind was already racing. She knew the incident wasn't over. She needed to make sure her message reached a broader audience. As she left the store, Karen pulled out her phone and began typing furiously. Her fingers flew across the screen as she crafted a post for her social media accounts. Today I stood up to hate, she wrote. I confronted a man wearing a symbol of division and ignorance in my local grocery store. The store manager tried to silence me, but I refused to back down. We can't let these things go unchecked. She attached a photo of the man she had secretly snapped during their confrontation, along with a caption urging her followers to share the post. Within minutes, the notifications began pouring in. Likes, comments, and shares flooded her phone as people from all over chimed in. Some praised her bravery, while others criticized her actions. Karen smiled to herself, convinced that she had done the right thing. She had taken a stand, and now her voice was being heard. But as she drove home, unaware of the consequences that were already beginning to unfold, she couldn't shake the feeling that the man's calm, knowing smile held a deeper meaning. What she didn't know was that her viral post had set something much bigger into motion, something that would challenge everything she thought she knew about justice, accountability, and the ripple effects of her actions. Unveiling the storm. Karen sat at her kitchen table that evening, her laptop open in front of her and her phone buzzing incessantly with notifications. Her social media post had gained traction faster than she expected, and the comments section was already a battleground. Supporters hailed her as a hero for standing up against what they perceived as bigotry, while critics accused her of overstepping boundaries and violating someone else's rights. Her heart raced with adrenaline as she skimmed through the comments. Way to go, Karen. More people need to call out hate when they see it. What a brave woman. We need more like her. But then there were the harsher ones. You had no right to take that man's property. This isn't the way to address political differences. So you're against division, but you're creating more of it with this stunt. Hypocrite. Karen's fingers hovered over the keyboard, itching to reply. She wanted to defend herself, to explain why she had done what she did. But before she could type a single word, her phone rang. The caller ID displayed her best friend, Jessica. Karen picked up. Jess. Did you see my post? Karen asked, her voice breathless. Jessica sighed on the other end. Oh, I saw it, all right. Karen, what were you thinking? Karen frowned. What do you mean? I was standing up for what's right. I get that, but did you really have to grab the guy's hat? Jessica said. I mean, you know people are going to twist this into something else, right? Karen leaned back in her chair, frustration bubbling up. So what, Jess? I'm just supposed to let people like him walk around unchecked. That hat represents everything wrong with this country. Jessica hesitated. I understand where you're coming from, but this is bigger than you think. That guy, he's not just some random shopper. Karen's stomach sank slightly. What do you mean? I did a little digging, Jessica said. A few people recognized him from your photo. His name is Andrew Hayes. Karen frowned, the name unfamiliar to her. And? Who is he? Jessica took a deep breath. He's the CEO of Hayes Enterprises. You know, the company that owns Harrison's Grocers. Karen froze. The room seemed to tilt slightly as the weight of Jessica's words sank in. Wait, he owns the grocery store chain. Yes, Jessica said. And not just the stores. He's also involved in several major philanthropic initiatives. He's known for being a quiet but powerful figure in the business world. Karen, this isn't someone you can just mess with. Karen's mind raced. Her triumphant stand in the grocery store suddenly seemed far more precarious. Why would someone like him even wear that hat, she muttered. Jessica's voice softened. I don't know, Karen. But maybe it's not as black and white as you think. Look, I'm not saying you were entirely wrong, but this could get messy, fast. Karen ended the call feeling more unsettled than she'd admit. She glanced at her laptop, the notifications still piling up. Taking a deep breath, she decided to distract herself by reading more about Andrew Hayes. She opened a search engine and typed his name. What she found surprised her. Andrew Hayes was a self-made billionaire who had started his company from scratch. He was known for his sharp business acumen and unshakable calm in high-pressure situations. But what stood out most were the countless articles highlighting his charitable work, funding scholarships for underprivileged students, providing disaster relief, and supporting local businesses during economic downturns. Karen's brow furrowed as she scrolled through the articles. This wasn't the portrait of a villain she had envisioned. Yet, she couldn't shake her anger at the sight of that hat. She closed her laptop with a snap and stood, pacing the room. No, she muttered to herself. He doesn't get a free pass just because he's rich and does some charity work. That hat is still a symbol of everything wrong with this country. But as the evening wore on, Karen's unease grew. The thought of facing a man with such power and influence was daunting. What if he decided to retaliate? What if her post brought more trouble than she anticipated? The next morning, Karen woke up to a storm she hadn't expected. Her phone was flooded with notifications, not just from social media but also from texts and missed calls. Her inbox was packed with emails, some from strangers praising her and others condemning her. But one message stood out. It was an email with the subject line, "Meeting Request, Andrew Hayes." Karen's pulse quickened as she opened it. The message was brief and formal. "Dear Ms. Lancaster. I hope this message finds you well. I understand there was an incident yesterday at one of my stores that involved both of us. I would like the opportunity to meet with you in person to discuss this matter further. Please let me know a time that works for you. Sincerely, Andrew Hayes." Karen stared at the screen, her mind spinning. Why would he want to meet with her? Was he planning to sue? Or was this some kind of power move to intimidate her? Her first instinct was to ignore the email, but a part of her was curious. What could he possibly want to say to her? After debating with herself for nearly an hour, Karen finally typed out a response. "Mr. Hayes. I am willing to meet with you, though I must admit I'm not sure what you hope to achieve from this. Let's meet tomorrow afternoon at 3 p.m. at the cafe near Harrison's Grocers. Sincerely, Karen Lancaster." She hit send before she could overthink it and then spent the rest of the day in a state of restless anticipation. By the time the meeting rolled around, Karen had rehearsed every possible scenario in her mind. She arrived at the cafe early, choosing a corner table where she could watch the door. Her hands fidgeted with her coffee cup as she waited. When Andrew Hayes walked in, she was struck by how composed he seemed. He was dressed in a tailored suit, his demeanor calm and confident. There was no trace of hostility in his expression as he approached her table. "Ms. Lancaster," he said, extending a hand. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Karen hesitated for a moment before shaking his hand. "Mr. Hayes," she replied, her voice wary. He sat across from her, folding his hands on the table. "I'll get straight to the point," he said. "I don't hold grudges, and I'm not here to intimidate you. But I do believe we have a misunderstanding to clear up." Karen raised an eyebrow, her guard still up. "A misunderstanding? About what?" Andrew leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "About me, about that hat, and about what you think it represents." His calm tone threw her off balance. She had expected anger or arrogance, but instead, he seemed genuinely interested in having a conversation. As the meeting unfolded, Karen found herself facing not just Andrew Hayes, but also her own assumptions, and the storm she had unleashed without fully understanding the consequences. Shattering assumptions. Karen sat in the cafe across from Andrew Hayes, unsure of how the conversation would unfold. Her mind raced with a mix of indignation and curiosity. She had expected him to arrive with lawyers, perhaps even security, ready to issue threats or demand a public apology. But instead, he had shown up alone, calm and composed, as though this was just another business meeting. Andrew leaned back in his chair, his expression neutral but focused. "Ms. Lancaster," he began, "I'm not here to argue or belittle your stance. I'm here because yesterday's incident gave me pause. I realized we might both have something to learn from each other. Karen crossed her arms defensively. Learn from each other, she echoed, her tone skeptical. What exactly do you think I have to learn from someone who wears that hat? Andrew chuckled softly, a sound devoid of malice. Plenty, I imagine. But let's not start there. Let's start with why you felt so strongly about it. Karen hesitated. She hadn't expected him to ask about her feelings, let alone in such an open, non-confrontational way. That hat, she began, her voice trembling slightly, is a symbol of division. Of hatred. It represents policies and beliefs that have hurt people like me and people I care about. It's not just a piece of fabric, it's a statement. And you walked into a public space wearing it like it was nothing. Andrew nodded, his gaze steady. I understand why you see it that way. For many, it has come to symbolize something far beyond its original intent. But do you think it's fair to assume that everyone who wears it shares the same beliefs, or that they wear it to provoke? Karen frowned, leaning forward. So you're saying it doesn't mean that to you? That you're just wearing it for fun? No, Andrew said, his voice firm but measured. I'm not saying that. I wore the hat because it represents a belief in something I hold dear, something I believe is worth fighting for. But that belief isn't rooted in hatred or division, as you might assume. It's rooted in my own experiences, my values, and my vision for this country. Karen blinked, caught off guard. And what vision is that? Andrew sighed, pausing as if carefully choosing his words. A vision where we can disagree without tearing each other apart. Where people can have different political views and still find common ground. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew everyone, and disagreements didn't lead to hatred, they led to conversations. Somewhere along the way, we lost that. Now, a hat, or any symbol, really, becomes a trigger for outrage before anyone stops to ask the person wearing it why they chose to. Karen felt her defenses rise again. That sounds nice in theory, but the reality is that symbols like that hat do represent real harm to real people. It's not just about disagreement, it's about the impact those beliefs have on lives. Andrew nodded. You're absolutely right. Words, symbols, and actions have consequences. And I won't pretend that everything associated with that hat, or the movement behind it, has been perfect. But let me ask you this, by snatching it off my head, did you feel like you accomplished something meaningful? Did it change my beliefs? Or did it just deepen the divide between us? Karen opened her mouth to respond but found herself at a loss for words. She had been so certain in the moment that her actions were justified, even righteous. But now, faced with Andrew's calm reasoning, she wasn't so sure. He leaned forward slightly, his tone softening. I don't blame you for what you did, Karen. You're passionate, and that's not a bad thing. But passion without understanding can sometimes do more harm than good. Karen bristled. So now I'm the problem. Me calling out injustice is the issue, not the people perpetuating it. Andrew shook his head. I didn't say that. What I'm saying is that your energy, your passion, it could be a powerful force for change if it's directed in the right way. But yesterday, instead of starting a conversation, you escalated a conflict. And that's what I want to talk to you about. Karen stared at him, her emotions a tangled mix of frustration, guilt, and defiance. You don't know anything about me, she said finally. You don't know what I've been through or why I feel the way I do. You're right, Andrew replied. I don't. But I'd like to. The sincerity in his voice caught Karen off guard. She had expected arrogance or condescension, but instead, he seemed genuinely interested in understanding her perspective. Against her better judgment, she found herself opening up. She told him about her childhood, growing up in a working-class neighborhood where her family struggled to make ends meet. About how she had seen friends and loved ones suffer under policies that seemed designed to keep people like them down. About how the political rhetoric of recent years had left her feeling more alienated and angry than ever before. Andrew listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, letting her words sink in. "Thank you for sharing that," he said after a moment. "It gives me a better understanding of where you're coming from. And it also makes me realize that we have more in common than you might think." Karen raised an eyebrow. "You think we have something in common?" Andrew smiled faintly. "I grew up in poverty too, Karen. My family didn't have much, and there were times when we didn't know where our next meal was coming from. I started my company not because I wanted to be rich, but because I wanted to create opportunities, for myself, for my family, and for others like us. That's why I invest in community programs and why I fight for policies that I believe will help people rise out of poverty." Karen stared at him, her preconceived notions beginning to crack. "But the hat." Andrew held up a hand. "I know. And I understand why it's such a visceral symbol for so many people. But for me, it's not about the rhetoric or the headlines. It's about the belief that this country is capable of being better. That we can find solutions that work for everyone, not just a select few. And I'll admit, sometimes I get it wrong. But I'm willing to have those conversations, to listen, and to learn." Karen felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to hold on to her anger, to cling to the certainty that she was in the right and he was in the wrong. But Andrew's words were making that harder by the second. "I don't know if I can believe that," she said quietly. "Not after everything I've seen." Andrew nodded. "That's fair. Trust takes time, and so does change. But maybe this conversation is a step in the right direction. Maybe it's a chance for both of us to challenge our assumptions and see each other as people, not enemies." For the first time, Karen felt the faintest flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward that didn't involve shouting matches or public confrontations. As they left the cafe, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting had been more than just a conversation. It had been a turning point, one that would force her to reevaluate not just her actions, but also her beliefs about the world and the people in it. The ripple effect. Karen spent the days following her meeting with Andrew in a haze of self-reflection. It wasn't in her nature to dwell on her actions, she prided herself on being decisive and steadfast. But Andrew's words lingered, challenging her to examine not only what she had done, but why she had done it. More troubling was the realization that her impulsiveness had overshadowed her message, leaving her feeling less like a champion of justice and more like a public spectacle. The fallout from the grocery store incident hadn't died down. A local news station had picked up the viral video, dubbing her the Red Hat Rebel. Social media was ablaze with arguments about her actions, and her name was now associated with hashtags ranging from #KarenHero to #KarenGoneTooFar. Her friends and family had reached out, some to offer their support, others to gently critique her approach. It wasn't until her best friend, Sarah, visited her apartment that Karen finally allowed herself to voice the internal conflict that had been simmering since her meeting with Andrew. "You don't understand, Sarah," Karen said, pacing her living room. "I've spent years fighting for what I believe in. Standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves. And now, because of one moment, I'm being painted as some kind of lunatic." Sarah, ever the voice of reason, sipped her coffee and watched Karen with calm eyes. "You have to ask yourself something, Karen. Was it about making a statement or making a difference? Because those aren't always the same thing." Karen stopped mid-pace, frowning. "What are you saying? That I shouldn't have confronted him?" "No, I'm saying the way you confronted him mattered," Sarah replied. "Look, I know your heart's in the right place. But ripping the hat off his head? That wasn't about starting a conversation, it was about making a point. And now, instead of people talking about the issues you care about, they're talking about you." Karen sank into her couch, her shoulders slumping. "I didn't think it through," she admitted. "I just reacted. I saw that hat, and all I could think about was everything it represents, the pain, the division, the injustice. I couldn't let it go. Sarah nodded. I get it. But here's the thing, you met the guy. You had a conversation with him. And from what you've told me, he wasn't the monster you thought he'd be. Maybe that's a lesson in itself. Karen sighed, staring at the ceiling. He said something that's been stuck in my head. He said I escalated the conflict instead of starting a conversation. And I hate to admit it, but he was right. Sarah set her coffee down and leaned forward. So, what are you going to do about it? That was the question Karen had been avoiding. What could she do? The world had already made up its mind about her, or so she thought. But then she remembered Andrew's parting words, trust takes time, and so does change. A new approach. Karen decided to start small. She knew she couldn't erase the viral video or undo the past, but she could use her newfound notoriety as an opportunity to spark meaningful dialogue. She began by reaching out to local community organizations, groups that focused on bridging divides and fostering conversations between people with differing views. To her surprise, many were eager to work with her, seeing her experience as a way to highlight the importance of dialogue over confrontation. Her first public appearance since the incident was at a town hall meeting organized by a nonprofit called Voices Together. The event, held in a local library, was designed to bring people from all walks of life together to discuss contentious issues in a respectful and open environment. Karen was nervous as she took her seat at the front of the room. She had agreed to speak about the incident at Harrison's Grocers, knowing full well that many in the audience would have strong opinions about her actions. As she looked out at the crowd, she saw a mix of faces, some familiar, some not. There were people who had supported her in the past, people who had criticized her, and even a few wearing red hats. When it was her turn to speak, Karen took a deep breath and stood. I'm not here to defend what I did, she began. I'm here to acknowledge that I made a mistake. Not in standing up for what I believe in, but in how I chose to do it. In that moment, I let my anger and frustration take over, and instead of starting a conversation, I escalated a conflict. And for that, I'm sorry. The room was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Karen continued. After the incident, I had the chance to sit down with the man I confronted, Andrew Hayes. And what I learned from him is that people are more complex than we often give them credit for. That doesn't mean I agree with everything he stands for, but it does mean I owe him, and everyone else, the respect of listening before I judge. As she spoke, Karen felt a sense of catharsis. This wasn't about redeeming herself in the eyes of others, it was about being honest with herself. The unexpected ally. To Karen's surprise, Andrew himself attended the town hall. He sat quietly in the back for most of the event, listening intently. When the moderator invited audience members to share their thoughts, Andrew stood and addressed the room. I didn't come here to rehash what happened or to point fingers, he said, his voice calm and steady. I came because I believe in the power of conversations like this one. Karen and I might never see eye to eye on certain issues, but we both want a better future for this community. And that starts with understanding each other, even when it's hard. The room erupted in applause, and for the first time, Karen felt a genuine sense of hope. A ripple of change. Over the next few months, Karen and Andrew worked together on several initiatives aimed at fostering dialogue and understanding in their community. They co-hosted workshops, spoke at schools, and even appeared on a local radio show to discuss their journey from conflict to collaboration. Their efforts didn't go unnoticed. What had started as a viral video of a heated confrontation transformed into a story of redemption and growth. Karen's reputation shifted from Red Hat Rebel to someone willing to admit her mistakes and work toward positive change. More importantly, Karen learned that standing up for what you believe in doesn't always mean shouting the loudest or acting on impulse. Sometimes, the most powerful act of resistance is choosing to listen, to learn, and to extend a hand instead of a fist. And while the road ahead was still fraught with challenges, Karen knew she was on the right path, one that embraced not just the fight for justice, but the pursuit of understanding. Building bridges. Karen's transformation wasn't just a personal journey, it became a catalyst for change across the community. By the time she and Andrew had co-hosted their third workshop, the narrative around them had shifted entirely. What began as a moment of public conflict had blossomed into a movement to heal the fractures in a divided town. But Karen knew this wasn't enough. If she wanted to truly make an impact, she needed to go beyond surface-level conversations and tackle the deeper issues that created division in the first place. A community united. Karen and Andrew decided to organize a large-scale event called Bridge the Divide, a community forum for understanding. It wasn't an easy task. Both had to address skepticism from their respective circles. Karen's activist friends questioned whether she was compromising her principles by working with someone who represented what they saw as the opposing side. Andrew faced similar criticism from people who felt he was aligning with the enemy. But both stood firm. "We're not asking anyone to abandon their beliefs," Karen explained during a planning meeting. "We're asking them to see the humanity in people they disagree with." The forum was held in the town's civic center, and Karen was stunned by the turnout. Hundreds of people showed up, filling the seats and spilling into the standing room-only section at the back. There were teenagers, seniors, families with small children, and individuals wearing everything from MAGA hats to rainbow pins. For the first time, Karen saw the full spectrum of her community gathered in one place, and it was both daunting and inspiring. The event began with Karen and Andrew sharing their story. They spoke honestly about their initial clash, the viral fallout, and the journey they had undertaken to find common ground. Karen didn't sugarcoat her actions. "I was wrong to act out of anger," she admitted. "But that mistake became a lesson, one that taught me the value of listening, even when it's hard." Andrew echoed her sentiments. "We don't have to agree on everything to respect each other. And we don't have to like each other to work together for something bigger than ourselves." Their words set the tone for the evening. Attendees were divided into small groups and encouraged to share their experiences and perspectives. Trained facilitators guided the conversations, ensuring everyone felt heard and respected. Karen floated from group to group, listening as people opened up about their fears, frustrations, and hopes. It was messy and emotional, but it was also beautiful. The power of stories. One moment that stuck with Karen happened during a small group discussion. A teenage girl named Mia, wearing a shirt with a pride flag, shared her experience of being bullied in school for her sexuality. Sitting across from her was an older man wearing a red hat. At first, the tension between them was palpable, but as Mia spoke, the man's expression softened. "I didn't realize kids were going through that," he said quietly. "When I was growing up, no one talked about these things. I'm sorry you've had to deal with that." Mia looked surprised but nodded. "Thank you," she said. "That means a lot." Karen felt her throat tighten as she watched the exchange. It was a small moment, but it encapsulated everything she and Andrew had been working toward. The power of stories wasn't just in the telling, it was in the listening. Pushing for change. The forum didn't just end with heartfelt conversations. Karen and Andrew made sure it was also a springboard for action. They invited local leaders, including the mayor and school board members, to hear directly from the community. Attendees voted on key issues they wanted to address, from improving diversity education in schools to creating more spaces for community dialogue. Karen took on a leadership role in several initiatives, including a project to develop workshops for local schools. She worked with educators, parents, and students to design a curriculum that focused on empathy, critical thinking, and conflict resolution. Andrew, meanwhile, partnered with local business owners to sponsor scholarships for underprivileged youth, ensuring that opportunities weren't limited by financial barriers. Together, they proved that change wasn't just about grand gestures, it was about consistent, thoughtful action. Their collaboration became a model for others, inspiring neighboring towns to launch similar initiatives. Personal growth. Amid all the public work, Karen found herself growing in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her conversations with Andrew forced her to confront her own biases and assumptions. She realized that her passion for justice had sometimes blinded her to the complexity of people's experiences. It was humbling, but it also made her a better advocate. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings, Karen and Andrew sat on the steps of the Civic Center, watching the sunset. "Did you ever think we'd end up here?" Karen asked, laughing softly. Andrew smirked. "Not in a million years. But I'm glad we did." Karen nodded. "Me too. I still don't agree with you on a lot of things, you know." "Oh, I'm very aware," Andrew said with a chuckle. "But that's the point, isn't it? If we can do this, anyone can." Legacy of the movement. Months turned into years, and the ripple effects of Karen and Andrew's work continued to grow. The town became known as a hub for innovative community-building efforts, attracting national attention. Journalists and academics visited to study their approach, and Karen found herself invited to speak at conferences and universities. Through it all, she stayed grounded. She never forgot the moment in the grocery store that started it all, a moment that could have defined her as a caricature of anger and impulsiveness. Instead, it became the catalyst for something far greater. Karen and Andrew remained unlikely allies, their partnership a testament to the power of listening and collaboration. They didn't agree on everything, far from it, but they learned to respect and even value their differences. Together, they proved that real change doesn't come from shouting the loudest or tearing others down. It comes from building bridges, one conversation at a time. And so, in the place where division once thrived, a new legacy was born. One of hope, understanding, and the belief that even the most unlikely partnerships can change the world.